journalism and science writing. And she is the recipient of multiple accolades throughout these years. And she's also a member of the National Association of Science Writers. We welcome you, ma'am, and let's begin.
Thank you so much, Anuprita, for the introduction, and good evening, everybody. And thanks for taking your time out of your evenings to just, hear me out. So, it's great to know that, ICER Bhopal is starting off a SciComm week, and I'm sure throughout the week there is going to be exciting activities around science communication, which is definitely um, the need of the hour in many aspects. So that's great, and I'm happy and privileged to have been, given the opportunity to talk to all of you. So I thought I'll just give you a glimpse of what a career in science communication is, and then switch to a bit more in depth about how one can approach science writing, because that's what I do for my mode of science communication. So what I think we'll also do is, please let's keep this session interactive, so that if you have any questions, maybe you can use the chat option here and then shoot your questions. I'll be happy to answer them. Yeah, with that, let's get started, and hope we'll have a good session, for the next 1.5 hours. So without much delay, and let me just start. Okay. I hope you're able to see my screen. Do you see it?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so first let me just talk about, how could one craft a career in science communication and what you could expect, because I'm guessing some of you may be a bit new to, exploring what science communication is, and I just want to kind of, give a glimpse of how it looks. Um, so let's talk about what one would expect and what a career means for science communicators, and then we'll talk about what career options exist. I'm just going to brush through them, not really going to go in depth, in depth for each of them. I'm sorry about my voice. And then I'll talk a little more about what the Indian scenario looks like, and then maybe some kind of opportunities, which we will dig a little deeper when it comes to science writing in my other presentation. Okay, so yeah, so what is the science communication or a SciComm career right? So most of you, I'm sure, are students or at some plans of your, academic career. So probably you are also PhD students who have told your advisors what you want to do after your research, but then you end up, for whatever good reasons, that you want to, also have an alternative career, and then you may have many different secret plans, and for some of us, science communication is one of them. So that's how most of us will actually begin this, or at least 5 years. When I started mine, science communication as a career wasn't even something that I knew of. I didn't really have a plan that I would turn up and become a science communicator. So it just happened, and I'm sure for many of us who are already practicing science communicators, whatever you see in this particular comic holds kind of true. So, what have we seen so far with choosing SciComm as a career is that for me personally, it's been really intellectually very rewarding, because I get to kind of inform myself and inform people around me and have very exciting conversations about anything in the world, anything related to science, anything related to policies, and anything that has remotely something to do with science. So that's really something that has been my personal experience. And then again, today, thankfully, a lot of SciComm modes, like video, audio, which I mean to say podcasts and animations and videos as such, with Instagram coming in, and of course the plain old writing, and then blogs and several others in-person events as well, with some of the COVID restrictions easing out, have really given you a lot of good traction for science communication. And especially with COVID, people have also at various levels realized how important communicating science is for the public. So that's the good news, of course. And then now there are also institutes, just that I have the opportunity to speak at one of the institutes events shows that many institutes are realizing the importance of SciComm. Some of them are also setting up media cells, and they're looking for people who are interested in SciComm, not just to hire, but also train their students. So this is my third ICER talk. So that shows how many ICERs have actually been quite, passionate about having students introduced into SciComm. So that's also good news. And then also right now we have a reasonable ecosystem for some kind of mentorship to happen in India and also across the world. Many countries and many communities have realized why SciComm is necessary, and there is some kind of fostering of each other, opportunities that are arising because of this, and all good things there. And of course, like I said, with the government and people at the positions that they are in are realizing that there is a good need for SciComm. So a few grants are available, which are national and international, and maybe we can discuss it towards the end of the session if anybody is willing to explore that part of it. But yeah, so with these grants, I wouldn't say things are very hunky dory, but for some people who have kind of managed to get these grants and kind of make it sustainable for them, SciComm has been a way of life. So that's nice. And so this is not just limited to their passions or hobbies or etc. It has indeed turned into full-time careers for people. So there's also, of course, more than one path to success. I can just talk about my path, and there are as I had also mentioned in the abstract, there are 1,000 other ways people have become psychommers. So my path is not unique, but it's also not the only one. And I would be, glad to hear what all of your paths would look like in a, couple of years down the line. But all that's nice. You should also know that sometimes it's lonely journey because you don't have like this whole bunch of curated science communicators out there. Very few at the moment, and each one like they have their own journey. So there is no template like you finish your whatever degree and then you do these courses and then you are a psychommer. There's nothing specifically like that. So sometimes you don't know where to look for help. So it is good to be aware that a journey like this can also be lonely at times. It can also be unstable until you have made a name for yourself. You've worked in this for a long time. You kind of know what the challenges are, and you can bring in a lot of value of your own to the table, right? So until that really happens, this can also mean unsustainable, especially if you are a freelancer, because you could be scratching and figuring out where to begin, which also means that you don't have a particular paycheck coming to your account every month and things like that. So right now I'm a freelancer myself, and I do deal with all these insecurities, in the income, career, etc., and specifically so because I'm in a different geography at the moment. So yeah, so this is the reality that we all face. And again, don't expect to have heavy paychecks with SciComm, because most of these ventures are run by grants, like I mentioned, and also some kind of donations by either patrons or other sorts of people who think what you're doing is of value, and then they may donate. They may not donate too. So heavy paychecks are hardly something that people in SciComm really expect. And hopefully, if not for heavy paychecks, what is really deserving is a basic way to sustain our jobs, sustain our life, etc. So that's a bit of a challenge for all of the psychommers. I do know a lot of them who are struggling to kind of make ends meet if we only choose this as a full-time career. And then again, some of them are still thinking that if you want to become a psychomer, it means to say you failed as a scientist, or failed as, whatever your chosen path was. So thankfully that's changing, but that's not really true with some of people. So 5 years down the line, when we used to like approach professors to say that we would be happy to do a story on their research, etc., not many people really recognized what was done. Not many people were happy about it. People had doubts whether this was done for some kind of, financial benefits at the end of it, etc. So right now people do understand, so that's great. But there could be a few, some supervisors, some people at positions in different institutes who think that psychom comes later on. Let's not bother our heads there, but maybe we should just get on with our quote unquote research. Um, so yeah, that is a reality as well. And then sometimes work ethics are very shaky at many places where they say that they do psychom. The reason being not that people are inherently evil or bad. It's just that uh, with so many constraints that people do work with, and finance being one of the major ones, sometimes there is a big delay in payments for the work that's been done, or sometimes there could be some kind of malpractices, I would say, to just get things moving and things like that. So be aware to when you really start your career, if you are interested in it, just be aware that sometimes you will have to speak up and then call out things that may not really be the right way to handle. And then again, media houses, which have been traditionally one big mode for science communication in the traditional way before the advent of social media and Instagram and whatnot. Media houses had are seeing a constant decline in the number of published uh, you know print outlets, etc., that we are already seeing. Online is good, but then again, subscribers, it's hard to find subscribers in a country where there are a lot of free information, and then with the internet, so much information is out there, so people might be wondering, why should I even pay for something, right? So media houses are definitely seeing a bloodbath, cutting down many sections, and inherently science becomes one of them, because people tend to, whatever, from an editor standpoint, people tend to ask more for entertainment and gossip sections, but not science sections. So considering there is quote unquote less demand, many media houses definitely sack the science sections to save on their budgets, etc. So that's a reality as well. But given all those uncertainties and plain truths, and also the fact that psychom is really the need of the hour and it is a very rewarding career, this is how I think we could navigate this. So if you have a passion for science communication and an interest towards science, definitely take up science communication as your career, or at least start with it and see and explore how things work out for you, because we do need a lot of people in psychom, especially for a country like India, where we have so many people who are interested in some sense and who should know what is happening, because most of our institutes, including what you are doing right now, I mean, including where you are, is run by public money. So of course it's responsibility of the institutes as well as individuals who are the benefit of this public money to kind of uh, you know take what is the science happening within the four walls of the institute to the public. And then start your research early on. I mean to say, research on what science communication media you want to choose and where you want to, start your journey, etc. Get to know with people, explore things with others who have started their journeys, and like attend talks or hear what people have to say, etc. So get to know what is existing. This is something I did not do 5 years ago because I did not even know I would land up here. But then now that you do, maybe it's a good place to start and explore where, what, and how people are doing what they're doing. Again, don't wait for the right job to come to you, because there may not be a job until for a long time, or there may be a job that you can define for yourself, right? So because this is a very, very nascent field, and there are, like, tons of opportunities possible, so you could chart your own. So try SciComm wherever you have an opportunity. It could include your institute's magazine. It could include um, just being a part of your institute's outreach program, where you go and meet people physically and talk about what you're doing, etc. So try it every other opportunity that you do get. And I think just today the DST announced its Avsar program, where you can write about the research that you're working on. So any of this, all of this is a good place to start. So get involved in conversations. Like I said, there are a few established science communicators in India as well as across the world. So just tune into them, see what they have to say, be an active listener. If you can, contribute to the conversations. If not, just get to know what is happening, what are the challenges people are facing, what are the opportunities that that they're using to forward their career, etc. Always helps. And then keep up with the pace. So like I said, it's rapidly changing. It's a new field across the world again. It's not just limited to India. So things are changing. Something that is new elsewhere could also be brought to India, and something that is being practiced in India could be taken elsewhere. So keep a tab on what is happening. And then, like every other venture, try early, fail early, and find out if this is for you. For some people, this may not be the choice. They may be mesmerized thinking that science communication is something, but then they feel that, okay, maybe they're cut out for something else, which is definitely not a bad thing at all. So once you figure things out for you, I think it kind of emerges what you really want to do and how you can contribute in any way. So yeah, try different things, fail if you want, if you have to, early enough, so then you know what is it that you want to do. And especially if you're planning to start off as a freelancer full time, I would suggest have a plan B, just to make sure you can pay the bills and sustain yourself. But like I said, with so much uncertainties and some challenges, if you are starting out as a freelancer until you are very established, having another plan really helps. And with that, let me share with you some career options that I have seen in SciComm. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but there are definitely science journalists and editors, like what my path has been for the last few years. And then there are science communicators, where the only difference here I want to make sure is science journalists and editors are pretty much media based, so they do have a desk in some kind of newsroom. Maybe they are very restricted to science news, or like what I was with Research Matters, or they could just be mainstream media like The Wire or the Print or Deccan Herald and things like that. But with a science communicator, they could just be more physical, in the sense that they could really be meeting real people, either virtually now with COVID or in person, talking about what they're doing, what necessarily not them, but then what fields of how, and what is happening in different fields of science, engage with kids or maybe even engage with adults, just to share the spirit of science, so that you improve the scientific temper overall with the audience that you are interacting with. And then you have press information officers, who are basically in institutes media cells. So what they do generally is that they write about the budding research that is coming out of their institutes, and then pass it to different media houses, so that if the media house is interested, they can pick it up and run a story. If not, this is just one other way to reach out to people to say, hey, from this institute, this is what we have done in this week or month or whatever. So these are basically the press information officers. And then science content writers, which also includes science writers, in my opinion, who write content which is based in science. It could be articles for the press, which are not journalistic. It doesn't have to, evaluate or answer any particular question in people's mind, but just to say, okay, there's a new research and this is what the researchers found out. That's a science story. So yeah, so it could be just that, or it could be writing blogs. It could be writing working on different websites which are focused on outreach programs or outreach of a particular institute, etc. So these are science writers, science content writers that one could become, or you could be a social media or a multimedia producer. Like if you're really good at talking on videos or doing a podcast, or getting onto TikTok and Instagram and all that, running your own science communication channel, or if you are good at sketching or illustrations or infographics, all of this are multimedia that people love to engage with, because these are quite interactive compared to plain old text or other forms. So that could also be something that you could take up um, as a career. And then if you don't want to base yourself doing all this, you could also be an author for different books. So that's again something that is highly rewarding as well, where you research on a particular topic, come up with a book idea, and then work on a book. Or you could just be a fact checker, where you're reading someone else's articles to make sure what has been written in those articles is definitely true and then holds value, and then it's not something coming out of thin air. So these are very niche careers within the niche career of science communication. So but I just want to put it out there to say that all of these are possible. Okay, and then yeah, with that brief, I just want to give another sense of where we stand in India with science communication. So, in my experience, what I have gathered is that in the popular press, unless something is a breakthrough discovery, like the first image of the black hole, or something to do with the vaccines that have come up with COVID. Uh, Again, I just want to mention that the COVID-19 coverage that we are seeing in the media these days is a very rare exception, where science is taking some space in the front page. But otherwise, until unless there's a very great breakthrough discovery, which necessarily doesn't have to be in from India, science gets very little space in your newspaper, I would say, or even in any kind of media as such, unless they have a dedicated science editor and a dedicated science desk, which very few have. So science mostly stays in the supplement pages, obviously, because your main page is occupied by a lot of other, quote unquote important things, which could also be that some celebrity had a kid or whatever. Yeah, and then many print media outlets do not even have a science desk, like I mentioned, and they just run off of journalists who cover a lot of other beats, and science just happens to be one of them. So I don't have particular problems with that model, especially when people are doing a great job in covering science as well. But sometimes what happens is, until and unless those journalists really understand the nuances of science, like how science is done, what are the pitfalls of of a research, for example, or what are some things that people have to be careful when they're reading a research paper, etc. So when that is missed out, or when that is not very objective for people who are covering this, um, it may end up doing more harm than good in covering those kind of researchers, if those kind of research, because you're then almost circulating pseudoscience, right? So yeah, so in India, very few media outlets actually have a science desk, and most of those media outlets are English media only. So really, regional coverage of science is not at all great. So then, of course, like I mentioned, there are budget constraints with the popular press. A lot of uh, you know uh, bloodbath with a lot of firing and cutting down on budgets is definitely happening. With COVID, that has intensified, like any other sector in the economy, and also because of which there aren't enough journalists to cover local, homegrown science, and most of these popular media houses have some tie-up with international news wires like the Reuters or AFP and things like that, and they just publish science stories syndicated off of it, and not really fund a journalist from India to cover an Indian science. Some media houses definitely do this, but not all of them. And it would be great if every media house kind of, tried to do this, so that one, of course, they're helping Indian journalists do what they're doing. Second, also, of course, educating the people about what is happening within India, because here's where the taxpayers are paying their money, right? So that's definitely one thing. And the other thing, of course, is most of the editors are, sitting in some black box. It's very hard to reach them. You don't know where to pitch your stories. Some, of course, have in their front page how you can submit their stories, but not all. It's very hard to reach editors because the contacts are not really obvious, and it takes some kind of homework and searching to do to really get to these editors to pitch the stories that you want to write about. That said, there is, of course, a lot of things that has changed in the last few years, and one of them has been that the online only mainstream press that have come, like the Wire and the Print, because they are online only, they don't have to deal with the cost of newsprint, and that opens up a lot of options, because now they are not limited by the number of words that a story contains, or they're not limited by you know putting some stuff into the supplements versus on the main page, and the design of all that. So yeah, so these have definitely been good wings of change. And of course, because it's an online medium, it's very easy to break a happening story, right? It's really takes very less time. And then reader demographics, because they're online, are very different, because people who know to navigate the online space, typically younger urban audience, get to read them. But if you're looking at traditional media in terms of newspapers, there is a very different readership to that. So again, there are excellent science journalists and editors with these online mainstream press, which is great, and we need a lot many of them. And they're also generally open for pitches from anybody who wants to write a story about anything that they find fascinating in science. So these are the places where, if you want to break into writing, maybe you want to just take a look at them. And again, there are also niche science only media houses, like Research Matters is one of them. Then there is Monga Bay India, etc., where they focus only on science. They are not this generic multimedia houses. They're talking about politics and everything else. So they're just focusing on science, and specifically science happening in India. And the reach is, of course, way lower than mainstream media, but there is a niche audience for them too. So that is also a good place to start with. Some of these, like I know of examples of Monga Bay India as well as of Life of Sciences, where they have shared content with other mainstream media houses. But again, just sharing content is not enough. We would definitely need to have a lot more audience come into these outlets and engage with them to kind of take the stories that are here to a wider audience. So, what kind of ventures can one find in SciComm? So, right now, most of these science communication ventures are definitely supported by institutes, like the ones that you're having right now. You have a SciComm week. So similarly, there are other institutes who are, engaged with some kind of, like for example, ICER Kolkata. I do know that they have a magazine in science communication. I think it's called Cogito, and then they have a specific team that is dedicated from the university, from the institute, of course, who manage this whole thing, right? So yeah, so that's the kind of examples I'm saying, where right now most of these ventures are definitely held under the university banner. Similar things with TIFR as well, where they conduct um, Chai and Why, which is again held under the university banner. These are not definitely, they are run by passionate individuals. There is no denying that, but these are not just individual, guided events. These are definitely supported by the institutes. So right now there are a lot of that, and some of them take the form of talks and seminars where you can go attend physically, because of which it could be a little bit of a disadvantage people if you're not in in the same geography, right? For example, in Mumbai or in Bangalore, there are many such institutes which conduct these university talks and seminars, but then If somebody is not from these cities, it's hard to attend. And with COVID, that barrier is bit broken. Like for example, I'm sitting miles away and I'm still able to talk to you. So, but it's going to be a challenge, or it's definitely a wait and watch game. Looking at how this whole thing is going to change post COVID, right? So, and again, if you were to do on a individual basis, hardly there is some support in terms of grants. A few do exist, but then not a lot. So even with a single person doing this, sustainability is a concern. Many people have started and have given up halfway through because they can't. And like I said, some grants are available, but not many really know of their existence, not popularized enough. So that could also hurt a bit for those who want to take it up individually. And then revenue generating modes like running advertisements or promotions, etc., they're definitely absent. I mean, whether one wants to run an advertisement or a promotion is another question. But of course, what I mean to say here is the whole model of generating some revenue, because most often SciComm is seen as a benevolent venture where you don't expect to make profit, obviously. So but at least you have to make some way to meet your means, because you're putting your effort there. It is not easy, and you have learned a lot, and kind of crafted your skills. So how is that going to be repaid when your content is free and available for all? That's a question. And some people are really trying it hard to see how we can generate revenue, but that's not something that people have really cracked. There's no silver bullet there. And again, mediums of SciComm are increasingly expanding. Like I said, when we started out, writing was, the medium. But right now, writing is definitely not the only medium. There's a lot of people who are doing great with videos and audio podcasts and things like that. So mediums are expanding even in India. So that's a good news. And of course, people, if you have a bent of creativity towards arts and graphics and other visual forms, great. I mean, people engage at a far different level with these kind of visual forms as compared to just text. So there you have. And there are some people who have gone, above all of these normal forms to take science communication through movies, theaters, plays, and dance. I know of an effort from ISC, I think about 4 years ago, where they had this dance form to show how figs and fig wasps have this symbiotic relationship. So it was a great venture, I thought. And there are definitely some in pockets. These efforts are happening, and definitely to get these all of the efforts into mainstream is the need of the hour, in my opinion. So again, media cells in institutes and universities today in India are very few. I know, like you can really count on your fingers how many institutes in India really have media cells at all. Media cells, when I say, these are ones which are actually telling not just journalists but also the public about what are the kind of research outputs that are produced in these institutes. So like I said, that needs some kind of expertise with science communication, and that in itself is not something that is widely available. So there's a kind of a demand and supply. I wouldn't say a problem, but then dynamics that is in place to have as many media cells that institutes would have. And I really don't know how feasible it is in terms of funding for all institutes to do have it. But I do believe that these are definitely essential, and if there's a will, probably there's a way. And sometimes if you are working as the press information officer, some people do view that job as some kind of a PR effort. And when I say some people, these are not just external people, but also within the university, because sometimes they want to kind of show the university in good light. But if you are a trained science communicator, I'm sure you can distinguish between what is a PR effort versus what exactly needs to be communicated. So yeah, so having an institute media cell headed by a science communicator would be a good thing for the public, for the institute, and for everybody involved in this ecosystem. And yeah, so the good news, however, here is that a lot of institutes want to set up media cells at some point in time, and they're on the lookout for good science communicators. So if you do end up, kind of polishing your skills with SciComm, maybe this is one place where you can um, break in. So, and other careers like, say, video script writing, or a lot of other things like museum coordinators, etc. These careers are very, very few in India at this moment, and if at all, I don't know many people who have actually made high strides in this. So these careers, in my opinion, are really hardly explored. So there's a lot of things out there, and maybe any of you who are in this talk today could be breaking in there, and maybe I'll hear your stories a few years later. So with that, what do we have in here? Like I said, a lot of opportunities. Too few science writers or communicators for a country like ours with a lot of research output. And then most people are self-taught. There is necessarily not one single degree that I know of, which is not a PhD, that can kind of help you with science communication. I do know of other institutes which are doing this as part of their single semester course, but not a full-fledged course. And then again, regional science communication in languages that are not in English are definitely essential, and we don't have many people doing that at all. And there are also some lack of resources in terms of a dictionary, in terms of having an environment in itself that can help you communicate science that is in a regional language. Some languages have really cracked it well. There are good science communication efforts in those languages, but not all the languages that we speak in India. So with that, I just want to give you a sense of where you could help, or where you could see some kind of momentum. One is definitely having some kind of association of science communicators. The ones that apparently exist are not really very active, so maybe we need to kind of rethink of how we want to do this so that it helps everybody in the ecosystem. And again, a model to sustain these efforts. I'm just like kind of skipping this over so that we can discuss this in detail towards the end if any of you have specific questions. And again, since you're all scientists, or at least aspiring scientists, you can also help us with some kind of systematic study of science communication. Except for NIAS, and maybe one other center, I don't really know of any specific studies on the science of science communication that happens in India. So if any of you do want to kind of take it, or do some kind of baseline surveys or anything, that is also a great service to science communicators, in my opinion. So with that, I will just pause and see if there are any top of the mind questions before I get into writing specifically. So are there any?
If anyone has any questions from the audience, please put a Q in the chat box, or you can raise your hands. Until then, we from Chrysalis have a few questions we would like to ask you. So the very first one is that if you had the opportunity to start your SciComm/journalism career all over, what would you change?
Like I said, not many people had given me talks like this. So maybe I didn't really find it out myself, or maybe I was just dumb enough not to know. But there weren't so many events conducted as well. So what I would have done probably is, instead of learning on the job all the time, I probably may have learned a few skill here and there before I got onto this, so that it could have, I mean, it could just accelerate what I'm doing. So that's probably one. And the other one, of course, is to try and network as much as possible with other people who are already here. So, those networks really stay. So I got to doing that only after I became a science communicator or a science writer myself, but not before that. So if I were to start today, that's where I would begin.
Right. Okay. And so you were once a techie, and you were in comp science engineering. And so, like, it rarely ever happens that, like, anything you've ever learned goes to waste. So the question is that how do you think your degree or what you had learned in college prepare you to explore this new field that you were into?
Yeah. So I actually turned into a science writer by accident because I loved writing. Like even in my school, college days, I used to be the editor of these college magazines, school magazines, etc. And at that point in time, of course, those magazines did not necessarily have a lot of science communication in them, but just reporting on events that were happening in colleges or reporting on any interesting trend, whatever. So yeah, writing was something that I was definitely interested into, and then I came across this ad where before Research Matters became Research Matters, it was the Science Media Center at IAC, where it was headed by Sandhya and others who covered whatever was the research outputs from IAC. So I just joined the team and I thought, okay, this would be interesting. So that, I was interested and curious with science as such, although I chose engineering for my further studies and finished with a master's. I thought, okay, then this could help me kind of keep myself informed with all the breakthrough science that is happening around us, and it could also help me with writing. So that's what made me choose it. And yeah, I applied and I got into it, and then and then immediately Sandhya kind of she went on a break, and then I stepped in to handle the whole managing part of it, and then ended up finding that IAC is not the only place where great research is happening, so we need to expand our horizons, and that's where Research Matters was born. So throughout this, I think what really helped me with my engineering skills and degrees is how to objectively look at something, be it data, be it any claim that has been done, and of course how to read research papers, because I also had written a few research papers back in the day, so I kind of knew what to expect when somebody throws at you a research paper. And then I also kind of so with engineering and also with a corporate life behind me, I had this exposure of talking to a lot of people and finding out, just networking and stuff like that. So it helped me to also connect with people on the same level here. In academia, it's not the same, I would say, but then it also helps you to kind of break the ice, where to start the conversations and things like that. So yeah, so all of this really helped as such. And of course, the fact that I had a master's in computer science helped me write a lot of articles about computer science and um, anything related to technology at any point in time. Yeah.
Okay. So, from the audience, Megha is asking, in your opinion, how important is it to have a degree in SciComm or science journalism to start in this field?
Yeah, so there are varied views in this. For example, me, I did not have any degree, any course that is done. That I did before I started out, but it's not necessary. What a course gives you is definitely gives you an upper hand in terms of knowing something, but knowing is not the same as doing, right? So if you can get your hands dirty well, early in your career, if I may say so, or as soon as you figure out this is something that is interesting for you, I think there's a lot of things that you can learn on the job. And also, this is a creative pursuit, which means to say there's no one way of or one templated way of doing it. Each one has his her or their own way of exploring this field. So that said, considering in India there are not many science communication courses at the moment which can train you specifically for this, and considering you will have to probably go out and do it elsewhere you know in a foreign country where your tuition fees may be a hurdle in terms of finances. uh, I don't know if it's really worth that money there unless you are fully funded by scholarships, etc. That would be my personal opinion. But I do have I have heard that people who have some degrees in science communication would have their networks also built, because then you're interacting for 2 years with the same kind of people who are doing this over and over again. But the fact that many science communicators I know haven't really studied science communication as a specified course gives me the confidence to say that you can pick this up once you know where to start and how to start. Does that? I hope that answers your question, Megha.
So one of the important advantages would be the networking that comes along with the degree.
Yeah, just to keep
Uh,
yourself abreast with what's happening. That really helps.
yeah, that makes sense. So Umang has a question. If you can unmute.
Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, I have one question that how can we can you give some tips on being a better science communicator? It will be really helpful. Like, ma'am, what type of curiosity should I pursue to be a better science communicator? Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Umang. That's a good question. How would one be a better science communicator? Disclaimer, I don't consider myself to be a better science communicator. So I think I personally have a long way to go. But that said, I think where one could start is to first figure out what your audience is. Like who are you talking to? Who are you communicating with? Because understanding who your audience is the first level to tone down your messages. For example, if I am talking to a bunch of kids, I can't go and say, okay, COVID is this, COVID is that, and I might tell all the scientific facts that I know, but that would make no impact on the kids at all, because their life is very different from ours, right? I mean, they are in this phase of exploration. They may not understand the hard scientific facts, but they're curious. So I would rather start with connecting, what makes them curious. Like, maybe start with what a virus is, or maybe just start with how their life has been in the last 1.5 years. Why do they think their life has been that way? And, broach the subject from there. So I think for a better science communicator, the first and the foremost thing is to understand who you want to communicate this with, and then choose the right medium for that. So, for example, again, going back to kids, if I give them 2 pages of story written in English, how many kids can actually grasp it, right? So I would rather be a good communicator if I am talking to them over video where it is more interactive for kids, because attention spans of kids are very different from what an attention span an adult would have, right? An adult can sit and read an article on the bus or whatever, but a kid may not be able to do so. Knowing who you want to communicate with, and then knowing how you want to do that is definitely the other thing that I would add to that. And third is, of course, buckling up with your own science. As a science communicator, it's our moral responsibility that we are up to date with all the scientific things that are happening. Say suppose I am a science communicator in biology, I should pretty much be abreast with all the happenings in biology, and I can't be dated, right? So I can't be talking about something that was relevant, say 20 years ago, but not anymore. And science is changing. Science is changing at a very rapid phase. So keeping ourselves really updated with all the information that we can, and reading others' work, or being familiar with others' writing or audio or podcast or whatever that is, just to keep yourself informed is definitely essential as well. I hope that answers, Uma.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank
Just
you
call
so
me
much.
Spooty, so you don't have to say man.
Sorry, ma'am.
That's okay. Thanks.
Okay. You recently had a podcast with your alma mater called UVC Chronicles. So in that podcast, you had mentioned that one of your areas of work was with the dynamics of science and society. So like how science and society should be mutually appreciative of each other. So how exactly do you achieve the kind of synergy to foster this constructive dynamic?
Yeah, so I don't think we can ever be prescriptive. So I can't go on the street and say, hey, you have to know science. I mean, until unless it's relatable to somebody, until unless they appreciate something, they will not be open to kind of investing their time and spending their time and, really doing it, right? So I think for a long time, what has happened also is that when people have chosen to become scientists, they have also chosen to live in some kind of ivory towers, saying, okay, I am a scientist, this society does not belong to me, and I somehow exclude myself from the society and then do whatever I do in my closed labs, whatever, some kind of a setup like that. So, in the people's mind, a stereotypical scientist is also somebody who is very aloof, who is probably with this, white coat working in a lab and with beard and whatever, whatnot, and very antisocial. So I think that perception has to massively change and transform into somebody who is very approachable, who is very next door, and who is very, like real human beings. They have a voice, they can talk like me and you, and then they also are not absolutely flawless. As humans, we do come with a lot of flaws. Some people may be flawed in terms of how they conduct their science too, and some people may be just flawed with the kind of person they are, and that does not take the scientists away from them, right? So I think the more society understands how science is done and by whom, we can also talk about why society really needs to care for it, because we need to also show the society, okay, like for example with the COVID example, right? How much of research has been put through vaccines to gain the trust that it really works, and that communication has to be done over and over again so that the society will start to trust the dialogue that is happening and also engage with the benefit of the science that we are seeing in terms of vaccines. And only then you can stop trends like anti-vaccination or and pseudoscience and things like that. And also the other thing what generally happens with science and science communication is we often tend to think that everything is very objective. And when I say everything is objective, I also mean to say the society is objective. The society is not objective. You can't say okay, let's just live with merit, or let's just live with one view of the society. That's not really how society is. And that's where I think scientists, science communicators specifically have to have a sense of humanities as well. So you need to know what are the inequalities that really shape the university, and that also shape the scientist and the scientist's way of thinking and scientist's way of doing what they're doing, right? So having that plug of humanities into your science communication really ups your game in terms of taking the message to the public in a very impactful way. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers the question pretty well. Rishikesh has a question. He has two, in fact. Rishikesh?
Thank you for that nice talk. So my doubt was, so I had two doubts. So I had personally started off a YouTube channel, and I mean it was very difficult to basically translate concepts into my native language. So I was wondering whether there's an initiative underway to translate these scientific concepts into regional languages, or is that something that we should start pursuing as of now? That's my first question, actually.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
Do you want to ask your second as well? You want?
No. I'll ask that after this.
Okay. So I'm not sure which language you are speaking of, but I do know that a lot of languages that are out there do not have, to begin with, even a science dictionary, right? Because that's where you would look up for words that are true in English as well as in another language that you're translating into. So those resources are definitely the need of the hour. There is a what do you call, a center of some sort, or a task force of some sort at the central government level, who is supposed to come up with these dictionaries for science and technology in all regional languages. But as far as my latest recollection with that was, I think they had only Hindi and one other language. So there is still a lot of work to be done there. And even if you look at your local state government level, there should be a council for science and technology. And that council for science and technology also has a obligation to come up with a kind of a dictionary or a kind of word book for all that is happening in the field of science. And if it does not exist, I think that there needs to be a push for that to be in place. So, of course, these are happening at the top level. This will not solve our immediate needs. So, what I would suggest there is that you try and see what others are doing in your language. So, this is how I do. So, I also write sometimes in Kannada, which is my other native language that I'm familiar with. So what I do is, of course, again, the same challenges hold true there as well. Not many dictionaries that I can look up to, definitely not online. And having moved last year, I don't have all my book collection with me at the moment. So what I do is I do read other science communicators in Kannada, the works of other science communicators in Kannada, and those necessarily don't have to be contemporaries. We have had, thankfully, with Kannada, we have had about at least 50 years of worth of science communication efforts that have gone there. So while we don't probably have a ready to go to kind of a reference, I do think familiarizing oneself with all these works of people who have done that in the past and are also doing it currently can also expand my own knowledge of these words, or just get a sense of how others are doing it. So I think that could probably also a good first step to start off if you are indeed struggling with getting the right sense of words there.
Yeah, that clarifies my doubt. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the second part was basically related to the perception of scientists. So I mean, usually, yeah, popular media portrays them as these introverts who would prefer to sit in their rooms and do work, or sit in their labs and do experiments. So I mean, so would having written media or some kind of videos develop specifically for addressing this issue, would that be helpful? And also, would do scientists have any social obligation as such? Because in most cases, especially, so I am personally involved in physics. So in physics, most of the work that theoretical physicists do, it does not have an immediate impact on society. So how do you like reconcile with that particular fact?
Yeah, so blue sky research, coming to your last bit of the question, blue sky research is something that definitely lacks immediate application, right? But of course, as history has shown us, something that people have worked 100 years ago has been turned out to be useful, after 100 years. So when probably Einstein was breaking his head over, the general relativity and all those things, when nothing was even visible, I think people at that point in time never knew how their theories or their conjunctions would be proved or disproved in the next century. So I think what we can rely on right now is to fall back on the fact that there is history to support that research which do not have immediate application are still necessary. And the more people are going to be enthused with what is so fascinating about this, say for example with astronomy that we see regularly. Astronomy is fascinating for a lot of reasons for people, right? I mean, just the fact that these are massive stars that are bursting into supernovas, etc. They're kind of just catches people's interest. But when you talk about other things like say string theory, or you talk about condensed matter physics, I think as scientists or as communicators, what we are also missing is the wow factor there. We have to identify what is the wow thing, and then kind of connect that back to these to all your communication efforts to say that, okay, look, this particular laptop that I'm using right now is basically stemming from all the work that's happened in the previous whatever 50, 60, 70 years, and a lot of physics is going into this. And that's where maybe people would be interested every time they take out their laptop to know more about what is the physics that I'm dealing with, right? So that's probably one way. The more we relate to their everyday life, with people's everyday life, only then there will be a lot of curiosity in people's mind to really know about things. And until and unless that relatability is there, it's very hard to make people really care for these blue sky research. And once people stop caring for these blue sky research, obviously they will be questioning that why we are even putting our money there. as taxpayers, they definitely can question. Whether they question or not is a different question, different aspect. But they can, saying, okay, why are we even putting money into something that we are not going to be using, or we can't see applications? I think showing them how this is relatable in their everyday life can actually make it much better for them. And I think you had another question, which I actually forgot. Sorry. For the
Yeah, that
initial
was
part
related
of
to
it.
the perception of
Oh, yeah.
scientists.
Yeah, so with the perception, I think the essential factor right now is for any of us as science communicators to show that scientists are humans. I think that message is really absent in a lot of press coverage that's been done, especially in the past few years. I think it's changing now, which is good, but a lot of it has been that way. And also the fact that scientists were also not willing to come and engage with people, right? I mean, how many initiatives did we see of the ones that we are having now with ICER Bhopal, right? How many initiatives do we see like that around us? How many initiatives do we see where scientists are actually going to schools and communities and talking about science? I think more and more we do that, more and more trust really builds between the two communities, and then they start to realize that each of us is humans at the end of the day, and then those connections will build, which probably will kill all the unwanted perceptions that ever was there. Does it help?
Yeah, thank you. That helps definitely. And thank you for letting me squeeze two questions in the end.
So, okay, I think Anuprita needs to keep up the time here.
Yes.
So I'll just then
Okay.
move to the writing bit just to give you a glance of what it involves, and then maybe take a few other questions at the end. Is that okay?
Yeah, that works.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So let me stop this and okay, let me know if this is something that you can see.
Yep, that's visible.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I just really rushed through this to give you a sense of what makes a good science story in case you ever want to write one, which I hope you will all do. But yeah, so again, I'm not gonna know because you already know who I am. So again, this is all just based on my experience as a science writer. Again, this is not a definitive word, but just wanted to share what I've learned through the last 5 years, and give you a sense of how my everyday work kind of looks like, right? So I'm just going to talk to you about what are science stories, and then what are the shapes that they come in, and then how you could really pick up and do a story so that it gets published at some point in time. So of course, all stories needs to be interesting, and stories can come in different forms and shapes, right? Like for example, it could be a feature story where this is an example where somebody really spoke of one panda, which was really essential for saving the species. So that's the feature story that they wrote. And then it could also be a news story. So this was one I wrote about grizzly bears in the magazine Science, and this was about how or what in grizzly bears, help them stick around human hiking trails. And this is based on one single research. So this is mostly a news story, right? And then you could have interviews where people are going to talk about, you're going to interview people, interview scientists, interview not just scientists, but anybody who's involved in the ecosystem of science. So it could also be a lab technician. It could also be, somebody who just maintains equipments in your lab in different capacities, or maintains live animals in the lab. It could be anything. So just interviewing people. And then it could be science fiction. I'm sure some of you may have, read a lot of science fiction. That's a genre as well. And then science books, like I mentioned. It could also be opinion pieces where you have a strong opinion about something in the science ecosystem and you want to bring that up so that you can write them. Then it could be biographies. It could be photo, multimedia, or data stories. So photo stories basically are stories that are told through photographs. Multimedia stories will have some component of video, infographics, or interactive maps and things like that. And it could also be data stories where I am telling the story through a set of maps or charts and other data tools, so that people can grasp the intensity of the story. So all of these are different kinds of new stories that one could write when it comes to science. And the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to look at news stories because that's the lowest hanging fruit for somebody to crack. So yeah, like I said, you could be writing for lay public, who generally we assume is an adult with a high school level knowledge of science, not beyond that. So they pretty much know to call out what is physics versus what is chemistry or biology. Although I don't really believe in hardcore definitions like that, but our school system has taught that for ages, so they can probably make that distinction. And most science writing today is focused on them. So you get to a level where you're explaining everything so that people with not advanced level can also study. But what is also up and coming is writing for children, because a lot of kids and their parents can afford books these days. So books and multimedia content and whatnot. So a lot of people are also writing for kids, and that's an emerging field of opportunity, if I may say so. And sometimes you're also writing for other scientists. For example, if any of you have taken a look at this blog called The Conversation, so they are writing about their work technically for other scientists who may not be from the same field. So this is not a journal article at all, but this is for a, a scientist who is in biology writing something about their work for somebody who probably is I don't know, a chemist maybe, or somebody who's not very closely involved with this field of study, right? So and then you could be writing for non-speaking English readers or English speakers or whoever, right? So you will be writing in a language which is not English. So this, again, as I've also stressed before, a vital need in India, but how to do it is a discussion on its own. So not even going to brush there. So this is the typical science news cycle that we all are familiar with, as well as what happens, right? So initially you slog multiple years to come up with your research paper, and then once it is done, if your institute has a PR office or the press relations office, they will kind of make a story out of it and give it to journalists, right, and newswire organizations. So you have said something with a lot of checks and balances in your research paper, and the university office kind of trims it up to say that, okay, whether something is correlation or a causation, they just the difference is very muddled, and they just say that A causes B. If there is a good science communicator at this PR office, maybe that doesn't really happen. But if it is somebody who may not really know the nuances of the science that is being done, then this can happen. So this could be misinterpreted. And once you have the news wire organizations publish this is where all your media houses pick it up from. So everybody starts relaying it in their particular channels, and then you have that message reaching the public. So in this case, it's the grandma, but it could be anybody, right? So and then, as you can see, there is a problem here, right? So by the time it really reaches the public, there could possibly be distortions. And these kind of distortions is what science writers and science communicators have to really be careful about, and then try and avoid it. And that's why we need to have specialized, some kind of training or orientation towards what we are doing. And with that, I would like to say, how do you then find a story that you want to write? Because in India, for example, there are so many research papers that is published in just 1 year, which means to say each research paper is giving you something new in the field of science. But then how much is that newsworthy a totally different matter. And considering that there are so many institutes in India, we have so many people in India doing research as their not just academic pursuit, but also their careers. So, which means to say there is a lot of food available for us to chew on as science communicators. But is every published research study interesting? Of course, for scientists, if you go ask a researcher, they will say it is interesting, and that's exactly why they even publish that in the first place, right? But for a layperson, should we write a story for them about everything? Perhaps not, because a science story that you might choose will have to be, like I said, answering one of the questions, that it has to be very relatable and inspiring, and have to have that wow factor. And it has to be interesting, because your story needs to go from, you can't just say, okay, researchers just did this. You also have to say what does that mean for for anybody who's just reading this, and how did they go about doing it, because communicating the methods are also very important, although it's like the pale side of it, not the very interesting bit of your story, but it is important that people understand how this result was arrived at. And it has to be recent or new generally, especially for newsworthy. I mean, when I say news science pieces, it has to be newsy, right? So it has to be recent, and it has to be topical, and it has to it could be reiterating a well established but important fact. Like, for example, some stories really talk about something that some people already knew, like, for example, um, what caused dinosaur extinction, right? So there are basically two theories. One is the asteroid and one is the volcano theory. Both of them are there in the public domain for a long time. So maybe new research there, when you want to write a story, could probably be saying that one theory has new evidence to support it. And that could still be a science news story, which is reiterating something that we already know, but adding a new dimension to that, right? Then it could also provide some answers to questions that where they are in people's mind. Typically, this happens with physics and mathematics stories, where people knew something is observed, but they didn't know how it happened, and so these studies provide answers. But it could also mean that some studies will raise more questions, because now we know what we thought was ultimately true is not true. So a classic example here is the COVID variant, right? So many things are different with COVID variants that we see, and it also raises so many questions about what is the future of the vaccines that we are using, what is the future of the whole pandemic in itself, as to how it's going to end, what we need, etc. So it could be both. A story done based on a new research could answer questions, also raise questions. But eventually, what every news story has to be is that it has to be credible, based on actual good research. It has to be accurate. That means to say your writing needs to be accurate, and you don't end up with a false correlation or a false causation like you saw in the previous slide. And it has to be factual, based out of fact, and not something that you make up out of your own, right? So that's what generally, the basic essentials of a good science story is. But then, how to find them? Of course, recent published stories are published in journals, and some journalists, once you have started out as an established journalist, you can get embargoed access from your journals and other sources. And then you could also write about studies that are published in open access journals, which is of course available to everybody. But also there are closed access journals, and if you know the researchers, they probably will be happy to share the research paper with you. And however, when you choose what journal you want to take your story from, make sure that it's not a predatory journal, because as science communicators, you must know that there are a lot of predatory journals out there, and you should be careful where source is coming from. And then you could also be subscribed to different newsletters and digests from journals, which can tell you, okay, you know what, these are the research stories, research papers that we published this week. And maybe if something is of interest to you, you can start off right there. And of course, like I mentioned, institutes, press office, and media cells, which are not very prevalent in India, but prevalent in many other parts of the world, definitely are good sources for the story. And then your interviews and interactions, maybe you just met your friend at a conference, or maybe you just happen to bump into someone else's research seminar, etc. They can also be good, interesting sources for your stories. And then, of course, social media, where researchers these days will announce it that they have an interesting study, and this is what the study is, and this is what we found, and etc. So social media could also be a good place to find interesting research papers which could possibly turn into a story. And of course, own reading and research, like a lot of us already do. We look up on the web, we look up on in different books, find out what these institutes or researchers are doing, and then you might bump into something that is interesting from and newsworthy at the same time. So once you
Just a
have
heads
that
up.
research, yeah.
We have around 10-15 minutes left.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll just possibly cover with just how you go about it. I won't get into the exact writing of it, but maybe this should give you all that you need to know with respect to writing, right? So once you have that research paper, start to identify what is the problem it's trying to solve, and why is that even a problem, and then how big is that problem. Especially this is significant when you're writing about diseases or cure for diseases, etc. So it helps to give a sense for the reader as to how big that problem is. How many, what is the prevalence of that particular disease or that condition or whatever, right? And then what are the existing solutions? This is also important to say how groundbreaking this particular finding is. So whether people already knew this, or is this coming out of the blue? And then, of course, the novelty of the research. What are the important findings? What was known? What was unknown? And were there any surprises? Were there any backstories to this discovery, serendipity or accidental in discoveries, whatever that is? And then the implications, very important in terms of saying why the findings really matter. Who are going to be the beneficiaries of this? How does it impact anybody's life? And then again, the awe factor may not necessarily lie in the findings, but it could have far reaching implications. And that's what, as communicators, we can bring out to say why this is great. And again, understanding the methods used, which is definitely something that you will have to communicate over and over again so that people appreciate what science, writing specifically will be. With that said, I will just go back and show you one slide. So show you one slide about what a typical science story looks like. And I'm sure most of you have seen it in the sense that you've read a lot of science stories. So a typical science story is just this, right? It has this a lead, an introduction, a gripping beginning that you can give to a story, and then an epigraph, which is your one paragraph trying to say what the problem is and how it was solved or who solved it, right? And then you have the voices, basically quoting researchers or other sources that you may want to have in the interview, who will say what they have, like what motivated them to do this research, or what did they find, what was surprising, what was not so surprising, etc. And then you have the details that you write, right? Your fine prints in terms of what was the method used, how did they find it, where was the study published. All those details will go there. And then at the end, you do conclude your story with a kicker, which means to say, why is this even a big deal? So now the study is out. So what? No, that. So this is generally your story from the top to the end. Just wanted to give you that. And typically, a story is about 600 to 800 words, and generally, people prefer small, short paragraphs talking about these ideas so that you're not overwhelming your reader with a lot of information, which is going to be similar to reading the research paper altogether. So try and make your stories very, very descriptive, yes, but also very approachable for people who may not really understand a lot of science. And that comes with practice. There is no one way. I can't teach you in like 1 hour or one day. It does come with practice. And over time you will definitely pick that up, is what I would think. So with that, I'll just stop here and see if there are more questions. Is that okay, Anupreeta? I'm sorry, my son is right on the face here. Just move a bit.
Yeah, that works. If anyone from the audience has any questions, please put a Q in the chat box. Meanwhile, we had just one more question for you. Uh, what is your favorite piece of work in your adventure so far? What was there some one specific thing which was memorable?
Yeah, okay. So with Research Matters, right? So like I said, I was privileged enough to start off and hold my job onto Research Matters for a very long time, where I was definitely the one who was calling the shots. So I could just write about anything that I really thought was interesting, and also which I thought was would be interesting for our audience. But once now that I'm a freelancer, I definitely get the opportunity to work with a lot of editors who come with their own learnings, their own perspectives, as well as their own publications, which cater to a different set of audience. So I think one of the recent stories that I wrote for the Science magazine about grizzly bears was something that's close to me, because that was one of the first few ventures where I wrote something in a new geography. It spoke to like people who I had never ever known, and also it was science, which means to say they have a well established uh, like a flow for how to get this all out. So it started with me pitching the story to all the way with a few rounds of edits and then kind of getting it published. I think what was revealing to me in this whole process is that like even talking to the researchers, right? So usually I would do that over email back in India, because most researchers are busy. They probably don't have the time, and things like that. So in this case, I specifically chose to do it over phone or Zoom and things like that, and that really helped me get a lot of informal quotes that people wouldn't really write it in an email. Like for example, one of the researchers who was explaining to me about the study, who was not involved in the study, told me that the study that they had done was similar to how Fitbits work in humans. And that's not something that people generally tell you in an email, because that's a very casual kind of analogy, but that's a very important analogy that people will easily relate to, like the readers will easily relate to. So I think something working with small anecdotes like this was really nice for me. And yeah, eventually it was nice to see that it was published and it had a video to go with it, etc. So that
Right.
was a recent one. And I think with Research Matters, a lot of stories that I've written was this work of passion and sweat and blood. So all of them are my favorites. It's
Right.
hard to pick.
Anish from the audience is asking if you could elaborate more on predatory journals.
So yeah, predatory journals are, I think all of you may have some kind of ethics classes in your course, in your entire 3 or 4 or 5 year course, where you will talk about what are the ethics of doing research, right, in terms of uh, how reproducible it should be, etc. And then there is a particular peer review process that is involved when your research is actually published. So that the peer review process will basically validate whether your research is really sound, whether it is reproducible, and your methods are really accepted, right? So with predatory journals, these are journals which are published where you can pay money for. These are not necessarily open access. Like you're not paying the APC cost there, which is the cost that you pay if you're publishing in an open access journal. But what you're paying for is to just get your research paper published somewhere. So these journals don't necessarily have a peer review process at all, and they could publish research papers that are of questionable uh, quality, questionable practices. Right. So that is not to say good research journals do not do that. Like we have already seen that with the COVID example, and recently the the instance of NCBS where there were questionable research published in reputable journals. That does happen, but that is, I'm sorry, that is when there is a when there is um, uh, some kind of oversight or something that is very subtle that people can't really make it out in the peer review process. And the respectable thing there would be a retraction to say that okay, this is not a new knowledge in science. But with predatory journals, none of that happened. So anybody will or can, in theory, publish anything by paying that fees that is there. So if you see the Beall's list is a curated list on the internet that gives you a list of all predatory journals or journals that have been identified to be predatory. So another aspect of predatory journal is that they don't really have an editorial board at all, and even if they claim that they do have, um, uh, these people who are supposedly on their editorial board don't even know that they are on their editorial board. So they can just pick up any number, any names off the internet and then put there and say, okay, these people are on our editorial boards. So that's that's a that's a red flag, of course, and these journals are best avoided for these reasons because the claim in those journals are not really trustworthy. Does it help?
Yeah, that makes sense. Kartika is asking, when writing science-based research articles for personal blogs, what is the right way to acknowledge authors in journals? Is citing enough, or are there other methods of giving credit where it is due?
Give me 1 second, sorry. Sorry about that. So yeah, so the usual way we do it is right now we are publishing everything online, right? Like most outlets do publish stuffs online. So whenever you're saying that this is a research that you're basing your story on, there is a hyperlink provided. So generally with Research Matters, what we used to do is whenever you mention the first word, okay, now scientists in a new study have shown whatever, the word study would be hyperlinked to the journal page. So that is where your viewers can go and look up the paper if they're interested. If it is open source, all the better. If it is closed source, you can't do much except to link, to the abstract of that paper and just leave it at that. But yeah, so that's generally how it is done with online media. So that should apply for your blog as well. But if somebody is writing it offline, say for a newspaper, etc., generally people spell it out, saying that okay, in this study published in this journal, these researchers did whatever they did. So that's how, I mean, that's the general two different ways of doing it. We generally don't stick to citations and references and footnotes because honestly on a newspaper you don't see it, and on a blog nobody really cares. Hope that helps you.
Okay. Uh, Sharayu is asking, are there any kinds of mistakes a person new in the SciComm field can make in terms of financing and choice of publisher?
Yeah, so choice of publishers, I think mistakes would be to see if the publisher is actually going to have a good work ethic to work with you. Like for example, there is an editor who is communicative enough. It is possible. Like I've been guilty of doing that as well. Sometimes our inboxes are so overwhelming that it's hard to get back on time. But maybe a couple of reminders and then you don't hear from them, and then that it's hard to establish a working relationship, right? So I think once you see that there is a red flag in terms of working, that could be, like, for me that is a red flag, of course. Then that publication may not be something that I would like to stick with. The other thing right now that I'm hearing a lot is with respect to payments once your work is done. And this is not specific to Indian SciComm ventures. This is a global phenomenon, unfortunately, where once you have your research work published in some what do you say, some outlets, it's very hard to get your payments on time. So I think getting that feedback from others who have written for that publication can help you decide if this is something that's worth your time. And yeah, in terms of financing, I think the other thing is, of course, where you think this is all going to work out, and then you realize your grants or your donations is not really coming through, and then you put in a lot of effort. So my suggestion there would be is to test waters slowly, see where how much interested people are in your work, and have another plan or some kind of a cushion that you can base on, rather than just kind of like uh, going through. And another thing I would like to say is, some media houses do, I understand, do treat science writers as any other journalist, asking you to write every like one story every day kind of a thing. It's not impossible, of course, and I don't mean to say science journalists come from a special place compared to others, definitely not at all. But I just want to call out and say that while I understand the need for one story per day kind of a work uh, culture, sometimes it is hard to get your researchers on time, hard to get the inputs that you need, especially when the researcher's full-time job is not to respond to journalists, right? So that could come as a roadblock. So maybe it is a good conversation to have with your prospective employer or whoever you're working with, to set the expectation to say that, okay, this is how you generally do a good science story, and this is the time it takes. So, you both of you are in agreement with whatever you have decided. Hope that answers your question, Sharayu.
Right. So we have a final question from Rishikesh. Do science communicators have a responsibility to check for bias in scientific research? Because often a published paper is taken as the holy grail and the ultimate proof of their hypothesis.
Yeah, so this is a very loaded question to end the session with, because science communicators do have the responsibility of communicating accurate science. What is accurate science is something that we as communicators alone cannot determine. We rely on journals to say this, if this is accurate or not, based on their peer review process, because any science is validated based on the peer review process. And so far, for whatever reasons, good or bad, since the time of Socrates, perhaps, this process of peer review has really remained, right? So there is no financial compensation involved in the whole process of peer review, which is one reason why it stands out as something, as a moral obligation and a moral right, in the sense of the right and wrong, for people to do it, for other scientists to validate some other's work, and have this peer review process in place. So that said, like I said, it is possible that it slips this whole process, and some inaccuracies get in the way of it. As science journalists, I think we would be more obligated to verify the claims that are made in a paper, because we are going to report not just on the findings, but also kind of critically evaluate the findings, whether it really holds true in the field that is discussed. So that is why I would go reach out somebody else who is not involved in the study, to make sure that the claims that have been made in the paper is something that the field also kind of supports it, or whatever, right? So as a science journalist, it is my obligation to put both views in my story, to say that, okay, there are these researchers who claim XYZ, but then there are these researchers who are skeptical about that claim. So that's a good balanced story in this in at my hand, because I know this is the kind of confusion in the field. For science communicators, I think that's not always possible, given the access that they have to researchers, given the access that they have to research publications, etc. But what I think they should also do, at least as a first step, is to kind of update themselves whenever knowledge changes. Maybe they don't have the ability to kind of always check for biases, but if they do realize that something was biased and there is an updated, knowledge out there, I think as communicators, we definitely have to update ourselves with that before we go out and communicate it to people. It's not like the best answer, but I think that's how we can balance it given what we have.
It does. It has brought forth valid points, though. Okay, thank you so much, ma'am, for taking out time for us. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that this has been a very enriching session and a nice experience. So we encourage everyone from the audience to participate in the SciComm Week, which is from today to the end of this week. And do send us your write-ups of your favorite scientific concepts explained in a fun and interesting way. And we're always willing to hear from you and looking forward to having a very enriching SciComm week. So thank you so much for joining and stay safe.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. And if it is going to be of any help, I could share the slide decks with the participants so that
Yeah, that would be great.
things that I had skipped maybe can give you more insights.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Yeah, thanks for your time. Have a good rest of the evenings. Bye bye.